Right, well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the latest English Catholic History Association Zoom lecture. It's very nice to see so many of you logging in. Our lecture this evening is Hoax, the Popish Plot that never was, and we're very pleased to welcome as our speaker Professor Victor Stator. Professor Stator is the Jane de Grumman Professor at Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge. He's a published historian, the author of several books, including Duke Hamilton is Dead, Noble Government, and A Political History of Tudor and Stuart England. And his latest publication is the Titus Oates Plot, Hoax, the Popish Plot that never was, and the subject of his talk this evening. So welcome, Professor Stator, and we're very much looking forward to you speaking to us today. Thank you very, very much.
Oh, bless him. He's very sweet.
Thank you very much, William. It's a great pleasure to be here. I wish you all a good evening. It's actually mid-afternoon here in Louisiana, but and raining too. So today, let me just start by saying a little bit about how I came to this particular subject. In 1972, John Kenyon published a book entitled The Popish Plot, and I read that as an undergraduate, and it had such an impact on me that it really sort of set my intellectual and historical course for what now amounts to the remainder of my life, being in my mid-60s at this point. It was a brilliant book. And it planted in me an interest in the Restoration period that's really never gone away. So the question then might arise, well, why is it that you're writing another book on the same subject? Well, first of all, it's been 50 years since Kenyon wrote his book. And I thought it was time to retell what is, I think, a tremendously important story, both in terms of its value as sheer well, what would you call it? Drama, I suppose, and the impact that I believe that the plot has over the longer term. And here's one of the ways in which my work is different than Kenyon's. Kenyon was not particularly interested in the political side to the plot and all of the events that proceed from the plot in the world of politics. And one of the things that I attempt to do in my book is show the ways in which the Popish plot, as it was universally described at the time, was the catalyst for further developments in English and then British political history, which continue to reverberate to this day. I mean, my argument is that it was the plot which begins the process whereby we come into the world of party politics in the English-speaking world. And I'm going to talk some about how I think that happened this evening. But in any event, it was John Kenyon who led me into the history of later 17th century Britain. And I guess I might describe this work as an homage to that inspiration that he offered to me. So that said, let me launch into the subject at hand. What I want to do first is begin with the political context within which this story unfolds. When Charles II came home in May of 1660, he was welcomed, broadly speaking, with a very broad consensus, a welcome even amongst those who had been his father's former enemies, which was born, at least to some degree, out of the exhaustion that was the result of the interregnum, but also a sincere desire on the part of people to let bygones be bygones, and allow the past to be buried. And one reflection of that desire came in the first session of Charles's first official parliament, what comes to be called the Cavalier Parliament, and that was the passage of a law, the Act of Oblivion, which made it a criminal offense to refer to anyone's previous loyalties during the Civil War era. You could be fined as a result of taunting a former enemy for their participation on either side during the Civil War. That was an act which Charles II was anxious and more than willing to sign, because he was not by nature a persecutor. And he hoped that what would emerge in this newly restored monarchy would be a world in which many of the divisions of the past could be put behind England. As it happens, that's not how it turned out. The consensus that greeted the Restoration survives on into about the mid-1660s, but it had begun to fray by then, in part because acts of parliament to the contrary notwithstanding, people did not forget what had happened, and divisions remain part of English society and politics through this period. And that the principal division was between Orthodox Anglicans, those who typically had supported Charles I in the Civil Wars, and the supporters of Parliament, those who either were dissenters from the established church or who sympathized with dissenters from the established church. That division really, although it's papered over for the first few years of the Restoration, it becomes increasingly apparent as the years move forward. By the early 1670s, what we see in England in particular, although to some degree the same sorts of things are happening in Scotland as well, but is the growth of an opposition which is largely descended from that parliamentarian lineage. But it's also one which is, for ambitious politicians, a potential vehicle to power. And we'll see, I think, how that plays into this whole question of Titus Oates and his plot in due course. But by the middle of the 1670s, what has emerged is what I would describe as the opposition narrative. This is a series of arguments and ideas that are really very effectively embodied in this pamphlet, which first appeared in print in midwinter of 1678. This book, on account of the growth of popery and arbitrary government in England, weaves together a number of themes which were intended to show that Charles II and his ministers, more accurately, Charles's ministers, because the author was reluctant to point the finger directly at the king, but certainly Charles's ministers had been engaged for years in a conspiracy that would destroy the Protestant church in England and replace constitutional government by an absolutist sort of French-style monarchy. This argument was a very powerful one in the minds of many people for a variety of reasons. First of all, its author was Anthony Marvell, a very talented both poet and propagandist, a member of Parliament. He represented the borough of Hull in Yorkshire. And he was closely connected to a number of very ambitious and none too scrupulous members of the opposition. Marvell's own religious and political views were shaped by his service during the interregnum to the Cromwellian regime. He was a sympathizer for religious dissent, Protestant religious dissent. And he was the person who wove together these threads to create this opposition narrative, which was laid out in his pamphlet, The Growth of Popery. This was quite a powerful argument, and it revolved around Marvell singling out a number of particular issues and examples that he believed helped to prove his case. So he looked at a number of things that had been going on in the 1670s, and he pointed to them as evidence of this conspiracy. One of the elements here was the Treaty of Dover, signed in 1670, that made peace between France and England. The Treaty of Dover was, Marvell said, and this is, of course, without his knowledge of the secret clauses of the Treaty of Dover, which really would have given him a field day because it committed Charles to conversion to Catholicism in the long run at a time of his choosing. But that was not known. But simply the fact of a treaty with France was certainly grist for Marvell's mill. He argued that this demonstrated on the part of the king's ministers a sympathy for France that boded ill for English liberty. I put the gold coin there because that represents an important part of the power that France had to wield during the 1670s, and that was economic and financial. Both the king and his enemies, members of the opposition, accepted quite freely large sums of money from the French. The Louis XIV's government was quite indiscriminate in the way it attempted to purchase influence in England. It gave Charles II subsidies. It also gave members of the parliamentary opposition cash bribes in order to ensure their support. So relations with France is one element in this narrative. Another element was the nature of Charles's fiscal regime, one which Marvell and those who were like him argued was directed at creating a kind of arbitrary system of finance. The stop of the exchequer was the moment at which the king chose to cease paying interest on his debt to various creditors. It was not part of a conspiracy. It was part of economic and financial necessity that the stop of the exchequer took place. Nevertheless, it becomes part of the narrative. In addition, there was the evidence that Marvell pointed to that Charles II had brought England into war with the leading Protestant state in Europe, the Dutch Republic, and had done so in support of Louis XIV's France. Yet another brick in the wall of this absolutist structure that Marvell claimed was slowly rising in England. Another piece of evidence to help support this theory was that in 1672, Charles offered freedom of conscience to both dissenters and Catholics through the Declaration of Indulgence. Marvell and his allies chose to ignore the grant to dissenters. What concerned them was that Catholics were to be favored as well. And the result of the Declaration of Indulgence was exactly what had happened 10 years earlier when Charles tried to do the same thing. That is a parliamentary uproar that ultimately forced him to withdraw the declaration. And worse than that, in the succeeding session of Parliament passed a test act which required all office holders in the state to take communion in the Church of England, as well as to subscribe to an oath that required them to renounce the doctrine of transubstantiation. Well, one of the first and most obvious casualties of the Test Act in 1673 was Charles's brother, James, Duke of York. Suspicions about James's religion had swirled for some time before 1673, but the passage of the Test Act made it clear that James was now irrevocably Catholic. And that was a problem as far as many people were concerned. And for the opposition, people like Marvell, it was a hugely significant thing, because it meant that the heir to the throne would be in a position to complete the plot which they say existed. So this is the state of play when in 1678 a bombshell falls on the British political world, when news of a conspiracy aimed at the assassination of the king and his replacement by the Catholic King James became public. When these revelations were heard, it came at the very moment that the political calendar of 1678 was about to reopen. Parliament had been out of session over the summer of 1678, and it was due to reopen in November of 1678. And in the weeks preceding that, Charles's leading minister, the Lord Treasurer, the Earl of Danby, had been planning to do battle against Marvell and his allies. Marvell, by the way, is dead at this point. He died during the summer of 1678, so he's no longer a factor, but he left behind him this very powerful narrative, which Danby's enemies, the most important of whom was Anthony Ashley Cooper, the Earl of Shaftesbury, intended to use to inflict damage on Osborne and his ministry, and the goal was to turf Danby out and force the king to take Shaftesbury in. This battle had been looming for months. In fact, various skirmishes between Danby and Shaftesbury had taken place over the previous 3 years. And in most of those clashes, Shaftesbury had been the loser. In fact, he spent some time in the Tower of London as a result of one of his failed clashes against Shaftesbury. But now there was something very different and very much more promising, and that was the news revealed by a clergyman of the Church of England named Titus Oates, that this conspiracy to overthrow Charles II and the Protestant Church, and to impose Popish tyranny on Britain, was afoot. This was a weapon instantly seized upon by Shaftesbury as a means of pushing through his own agenda, which is the destruction of Danby and his replacement by himself and his allies in power. Oates was a charlatan, a person who it would take only the most imaginative author of fiction to dream up. But the truth was that he was a truly terrible person. And just to kind of give you a brief summary of his various malfeasances, his father was a Baptist hedge preacher during the interregnum who saw the light at the Restoration and who got himself ordained in the Church of England. His son, likewise, was a convert to the Church of England immediately following the Restoration. He enrolled in Cambridge on a scholarship and was quickly expelled because of the fact that he cheated a variety of Cambridge merchants out of merchandise. He proved to be less than honest in other respects too, particularly he was more or less addicted to perjury. He then transferred his base of operations to Hastings, which is where his father had a living in one of the churches there. His Oates Sr.'s wife was a Hastings girl who had connections in the local community, and that secured her husband a living in the church there. Oates followed in his father's footsteps and gained a position as a schoolmaster there. As a schoolmaster, he was soon discovered to have a very unhealthy interest in his charges, an interest which landed him in court, accused of perjury, and then he ended up leaving in disgrace that position. He then found a living in Kent, in the parish of Bobbing in Kent, where within a few months he was again run out of the community, this time in the midst of charges of absurd petty thefts like stealing chickens from his parishioners. That having been done, Oates's next port of call, and it was literally that, was he became a chaplain in the Royal Navy. And he embarked upon a voyage to North Africa. The port of Tangier was at this point an English possession, and Oates's ship sailed to Tangier on royal business. By the time he got to Tangier, he was already in irons for sodomy, and he barely escaped that adventure with his life. Having pretty thoroughly worn out his welcome in the Church of England, Oates then, on his return to England, made connections with members of the London Catholic community. And he presented himself as a legitimate minister of the Church of England who wanted to convert to Catholicism. Now, Anglican clergy converts did not walk in the door all that often in most English Catholic missions. And the Catholic mission in London, which was a very well-organized and quite successful mission, had one weakness, or at least one weakness, I guess I might say, and that was that it was quite insular. And what members of the Catholic community in London knew about Oates was clearly not enough. And so the head of the Jesuit mission was persuaded by Oates's tale, and he agreed to send him to Europe to become a Jesuit postulant. And off he goes, first to Spain, where he enrolls in an English Jesuit college there. And within weeks, he was expelled for his inveterate pederasty. He then relocated to the Austrian Netherlands, well, I guess they're the Spanish Netherlands at this point, where he does exactly the same thing and is again expelled. And so he returns to London, having now completely worn out his welcome with the English Catholic community. So what's a charlatan to do? Well, what happened in the summer of 1678, as Oates was literally starving in the streets of London, was that he made a connection with another minister of the Anglican Church named Israel Tongue. Israel Tongue had been a successful schoolmaster and Anglican intellectual, but by this time he had come very close to the edge of insanity, brought there in no small part because of his absolute mania about the Society of Jesus. He believed that the Jesuits were out to get him because he had written a 400-page long polemical tome, which nobody could read because it was so convoluted and poorly structured and argued. Nevertheless, he believed that that book had marked him for death from the Jesuits. Oates, in this relationship with Israel Tongue, decided, aha, I know some Jesuits in London. I know where they live. I know details about their community. And perhaps this is my salvation. And it's from those circumstances that Oates launched his assault on London and England's Catholics and the story of the plot directed against the king. Now, he brought this story to the king in August of 1678, and Charles was skeptical, as he had a right to be, but unfortunately, the Earl of Danby, who was looking for a tool to use in the upcoming session of Parliament, thought that perhaps the investigation of this conspiracy, which he believed was plausible, to give him his due, he was not like some others who saw through these claims from the beginning. He thought that by further investigating these charges, he might be able to rally support in the upcoming session of Parliament. So he encouraged the king to launch an investigation. That investigation, which followed over the next several weeks, revealed an astonishing world that many people knew nothing about. And that was the world of the Catholic community and the Catholic mission in London. It was sophisticated, it was well run, it was far more significant than the average English Protestant had any idea that it was. And the revelations that this investigation produced, along with Oates's claims that various individuals in the mission had direct connections to the conspiracy to assassinate the king, led to growing panic on the part of the general population. This was an unheard of conspiracy, an unprecedented thing, except it wasn't that unprecedented because every English Protestant had been raised on stories of the gunpowder plot, for example, with their mother's milk. And it was not at all implausible to the average English Protestant that some dastardly assassination plot was well within the capacity of the Jesuit mission. So there is, from the beginning, a predisposition to believe this plot. And to make matters worse, there was the mysterious and horrifying and panic-inducing murder of the London magistrate Edmund Godfrey. Edmund Godfrey was the justice of the peace to whom Oates and Tongue actually drops out of the whole process fairly quickly, so Oates becomes the standard bearer of the plot soon. In any event, it was Godfrey who was the first person to hear the charges that Oates made against London's Catholics. And within 2 weeks of those charges being brought before Godfrey, he disappeared. He left his home in London one day and vanished into thin air. It wasn't until a week later, and this was less than a month before Parliament was supposed to reopen, less than a month later, his corpse was discovered near Primrose Hill on the outskirts of London. The body showed signs of strangulation. It was also transfixed with a post-mortem wound. A sword had been driven through his chest and into the ground behind him. He still had on him money and jewelry. And the immediate assumption on the part of virtually everybody, encouraged by Oates, was that Godfrey had been murdered by English Catholics to keep him silent about the details of the plot. Now, anyone who looked closely at the story might well have questioned the reality of all of this, but the fact of the matter was that coming when it did, as the panic about this possible conspiracy and uprising, at this point, Oates has added to his story a Catholic rebellion involving 50,000 bloodthirsty, arms-bearing people who were going to rise up and slaughter all good Protestants. Well, when Oates's story about Godfrey came out, the panic heightened still further. London was overwhelmed by the fear of this imminent uprising. This particular dagger you see here was one produced by London cutlers. The gold part of it there bears a legend that commemorates Godfrey and denounces his alleged murder by the Catholics. And people walked around London wearing these daggers because they were fearful that a Jesuit was likely to hop out at them from any bush or street corner. And thousands of them were sold, as well as many thousands of other sort of knickknacks. London tradesmen were nothing if not ingenious when it came to chasing a shilling or two. This is one example of the sort of souvenirs that were produced in the aftermath of Godfrey's death. If you turn the medal on the left upside down, what you see is the figure of the Pope wearing his tiara. If you look at it in this orientation, that is supposedly Satan on the left. And on the right, you see the poor martyred Edmund Godfrey with the cravat which allegedly strangled him. The reality of Godfrey's death is a lot more prosaic. Alan Marshall has written a really superb book that focuses on Godfrey's death. What is almost certainly the case, and that Marshall shows, I think, without much doubt, is that Godfrey was in fact a suicide. He probably hanged himself. He was known as a depressive. He probably hanged himself, and his brothers, who stood to inherit his estate, made his death look like a murder, because otherwise they would have forfeited that estate to the crown, the punishment of a suicide. So he was probably a suicide. He certainly was not murdered by any Catholic conspiracy. Still, coming when it did, this meant that the nation was completely panicked by the imminence of this conspiracy, and soon there were victims. The first victim of the plot was a young goldsmith by the name of William Staley, who was accused of threatening the life of the king in his cups in a tavern. It's almost certainly the case that those who informed on him did so in order to collect a reward. Staley was nevertheless quickly tried and executed. Staley was only sort of the beginning of the process, one which, when it was over, resulted in the trial and condemnation and execution of a couple of dozen completely innocent people, both lay and Catholic clergy. But probably the most significant of the early prosecutions was that of Edward Coleman. And here again, we have a situation in which pure chance and luck leads to the further strengthening of the story that Oates and his fellow informers produced. Coleman had been, for a brief time, the secretary to the Duchess of York. And he was a Catholic convert. He had been raised in an Anglican household, but at some point he converted to Catholicism, and he was rewarded for his conversion by this position as secretary to the Duchess of York. He had left that position by the time the plot broke out, but he was well known to Oates as a member of the Catholic community in London, and so he was a target of the early searches that took place on the part of the authorities. And they found in Coleman's lodgings a large number of pieces of correspondence, letters, and the like, written by Coleman and to Coleman from a number of prominent Catholics, not least of whom was Père Lachaise, who was Louis XIV's confessor. So the authorities seized these letters, and Oates says that it's all part of the conspiracy, that the French are involved and Louis XIV is involved. And here we can prove it because Coleman has letters to and from the French king's confessor. Well, the letters are all pretty much innocuous, but they include some rather unwise statements on Coleman's part about how he hoped that the work of conversion of England would someday come to fruition. That was sufficient to mark him in the eyes of most English Protestants as a bona fide member of the Popish Plot. He was tried and convicted in a deeply unfair proceeding, as most of these trials were. But the important thing about it was that he enabled Oates and his now number one ally, the Earl of Shaftesbury, to link James, Duke of York, directly to the plot. In addition, this panicky world results in the widespread abuse of testimony by informers who emerge from the woodwork in pursuit of the rewards promised by the government. This is a proclamation that promises £500 reward to anyone who offered testimony leading to the uncovering of people involved in the plot. So that meant that any number of frauds and charlatans, William Bedloe, for example, who was a horse thief and a petty crook, who had once actually swindled Oates when they crossed paths once in Spain, but nevertheless, the two became allies when they began supporting one another's tales. Bedloe, Stephen Dugdale, who was a confidence trickster who was going to prison or about to go to prison because he had embezzled funds from his master for whom he was steward. Miles Prance, who was perhaps less culpable than the other two. He was a Roman Catholic craftsman who made silver objects for London Catholics. And because of his connection to those Londoners, Oates identified him as a member of the conspiracy. To save himself, France turned King's evidence and manufactured a whole series of stories about other innocents who swiftly ended up in prison. And soon thereafter ended up before Sir William Scroggs, the Chief Justice of the Court of King's Bench. Scroggs was perhaps the original hanging judge. He was deeply prejudiced against Catholics, and he made it virtually impossible for the defendants in these treason cases to avoid an unjust conclusion. So by late 1678, early 1679, Scroggs and the London courts are scything their way through the defendants who Oates and Bedloe had identified, and conviction after conviction was being obtained. And yet at the same time, there was the gradual rise of skepticism on the part of many who, through watching the trials, and also, in no small measure, witnessing the execution of those who had been convicted, were beginning to question the narrative as it had been delivered by Oates and the other informers. One particularly powerful moment in this respect was that there were a group of 5 young Jesuit priests who Oates had accused and who were tried before Scroggs. And the defense that they put up was, as you might expect amongst a group of very highly educated Jesuits skilled in rhetoric and debate, they made mincemeat of the prosecution and its witnesses, and yet they were all convicted. But most significantly, they all went to their deaths in a very stoic way, and down to the last moment, they presented very persuasive cases for their innocence. In this atmosphere, there was a growing skepticism, and what happens is that support for the plot gradually becomes politicized. And people who are skeptical tend to be those who are either friends with or sympathetic with James, Duke of York, or who could trace their own political and religious lineage to royalism during the Civil Wars. Those who tend to maintain their firm belief in the conspiracy tend to be those who fall into the other camp. What then emerges is a growing political free-for-all in which the two sides begin propagandizing for their own perspective, either a skeptical one or a one which supports the charges. It was a field day for London's printers because there were hundreds and hundreds of titles published during this period, taking one side or the other. And it feeds into the growing political movement which emerges at just about the same time, which is the movement to exclude James, Duke of York, from the succession to the crown. And by the late spring of 1679, what you end up with is a world in which everybody who supports exclusion firmly believes or pretends to believe in the plot, whereas those who oppose it are almost all champions of the skeptical school of thought. Probably the turning point came, oh, and here's another bit of London entrepreneurship. These are stove tiles produced with scenes drawn from the plot. I should have showed you that a minute ago. In any event, playing cards, the same thing. In any event, probably the turning point came in the summer of 1679 with the trial before Chief Justice Scroggs of the doctor of Queen Catherine of Braganza, George Wakeman. Wakeman was accused by Oates of being one of the plotters, someone who had pledged in the event that the other assassins failed to kill the king, he would step in with a specially designed poison and would murder the king that way. Oates further claimed, although he didn't at first, this was an embellishment that he added to his story. He further claimed that the queen had participated in the decision to poison her husband. Supposedly, Oates said it was because of her rage at Charles for dishonoring her bed, which of course he certainly did to no small degree. But it was not a claim that many people saw as being possibly true. In the event, Wakeman's trial ended in the very first acquittal of an accused Catholic. Now, that acquittal may have come because the king had a word in Scroggs's ear. One of the things which is notable about the trial, which we can see from the published transcript, was that Scroggs was far more kind to the defense than he had been in any of the other trials. And in fact, in the end, he more or less directed an innocent verdict on the part of the jury. In all events, Wakeman was cleared, and the case for skepticism grew dramatically. That having happened, those people who were anxious to use the plot to further their own political goals then further tried to turn up the temperature by organizing propaganda demonstrations and campaigns that heighten the general hatred of Catholics and fear of the conspiracy. Though it has to be said, as in the famous Pope burning on Queen Elizabeth's accession day in 1680, that mostly these people are playing to their own audience, and they have largely lost the support of probably half of the political community. This was a spectacular demonstration, it must be acknowledged. At the end of it, a giant effigy of the Pope, which was stuffed with live stray cats because they would make a very satisfying noise when they went up in flames. It was very impressive, but it really did not convince much of anybody. Now, trials continue over the next year and a few months, but they become less and less effective at carrying the political weight that exclusionists want it to. The last gasp of the plot was when Shaftesbury and his allies attempt to open a Roman Catholic Irish chapter to it. And they accused Oliver Plunkett, the Catholic Archbishop of Dublin, of being a member of the conspiracy. And he was, in fact, brought to England, tried, and found guilty and executed. He was the last martyr of the plot. From that point forward, the exclusion crisis unfolds in ways that ensure ultimately that James will obtain his throne, and exclusionism is defeated largely because those who oppose exclusion have come to believe that exclusion threatens the repetition of civil war, and they didn't want that. That combined with the transformation of Charles II into what amounted to being a party politician who enforces his own political will on the nation and who dies in his bed, ensuring that his crown is left to his brother, meant that he actually wins the political war between exclusionists and non-exclusionists, a war which never really probably would have gone anywhere near as far as it did without Titus Oates and his fraudulent conspiracy theories, and which brought about the suffering and death of at least 24 people tried and convicted, and others who died in prison. If anything good came of the Popish Plot, I suppose one might argue that the creation of a stable two-party political system, which was sort of the upshot of all of this, meant that civil war was perhaps less likely than it might have been otherwise. And that is, I think I've probably gone on too long, but there we are. That's all I have, and I'd be happy, delighted to answer any questions that anybody might have.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Stator. It's a fascinating talk, and I'm sure we'd have been happy for you to go on much longer. If anyone does have any questions, please do put them in the chat for our speaker to answer. Whilst you're doing that, I'll start off, if I may. Towards the beginning of your talk, sir, you mentioned that Titus Oates' father had a background as a Baptist preacher, and about the attempts for securing toleration both for Catholics and for Protestant dissenters. I was wondering, over the course of the plot, was there any sort of public position adopted by the Protestant dissenting community, either in favour or against Oates' allegations?
Oh, the overwhelming majority of dissenters were fervent believers in the plot. They were, kind of constitutionally anti-Catholic from the beginning, and they were more than willing to believe any sort of charges directed against Catholics. I don't know that there were any formal statements made, but certainly the pulpits of dissenting chapels rang with sermons on the subject, and none of them were very positive towards English Catholics.
Very sad. We've got a question from John and Lindsay Mulaney here. Were any of the Catholic falsely accused victims ever candidates for beatification?
Oh, yes. In fact, nearly all of the clergy have been beatified. Mostly those came in the 1920s. Plunkett has been canonized, so he's Saint Oliver now. But yes, many of the martyrs actually have been beatified.
Thank you. I actually work in the house where Blessed John Gavin was professed as a Jesuit, and it was subsequently was executed. I've been told that gathering was suggested by Oates, by Dugdale, I think, as a possible venue for plotting the death of the king. Do you know any more about that at all?
Yes, that residence figures frequently in Oates's depositions and in his testimony, as a sort of center of some of the conspiracy and some of the the plans that were supposedly hatched, because I think Oates had been there and he knew details about, you know, what the layout of the residence was and who might be found there and that sort of thing. So it added a certain degree of plausibility to his stories, to be able to say, you know, you go to this house and that street and you will find Jesuit paraphernalia, you know, records of the Jesuits. One of the things which is striking about all of the trials, it seems to me, is that never once could the prosecution actually present any single piece of written evidence that demonstrated that there was a plot. And the judge, Scroggs, usually responded to those assertions on the part of the defense by, well, of course not. They destroyed them all. So the defendants ended up being in an impossible position of having to prove the negative, having to prove that things didn't exist. And that's not something that any one of us here on earth can do anyway.
You mentioned also that Oates had been to two separate colleges as a Jesuit postulant. Did the result of this plot lead to any sort of tightening of the rules or increased security on the part of the Jesuits so that this sort of thing couldn't happen again?
That's a very good question. I don't know the answer to that. I would presume that after all of this, the English mission would take more careful steps, but I don't really know that for a fact.
Thank you very, very much. If there are no further questions, or there isn't, I'm just checking the chat, there doesn't appear to be. Thank you very, very much, sir, for your talk. Very, very interesting.
It's an honor to be able to participate.
Thank you. It's certainly inspired me to read the book anyway and go out and purchase a copy.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Now, thank you everyone for coming. Our next Zoom talk will be on the 25th of April, and that talk is by Professor John Jenkins, and it is entitled A National Repository of Saints, and it is the story of the first half century of the relic collections at Westminster Cathedral and how the relic collections were used to promote and mould English Catholic identity by Cardinal Wiseman and his successors. No, not Cardinal Wiseman, Cardinal Vaughan and his successors, I should say. This talk will shortly be available on the ECHA YouTube channel, and there will be a post on the website. And we also have our upcoming visit to St. Winifred's Well, Holywell in May, visiting both the Well Shrine itself and St. Winifred's Catholic Church, which is an early post-emancipation Roman Catholic church, and tours have been arranged at both of those locations, and booking forms are available on the website. If any of you are not members of the ECHA, I would encourage you to join. It's only £11 per year for an individual, and further details can be found on our website. Please do encourage all your friends and family to come along to these talks. They are free, but without your support, we wouldn't be able to have them or indeed do anything else. But thank you once again to our speaker. Thank you all very, very much for coming. And on behalf of the committee, we all look forward to seeing you at a subsequent event. A very good evening to all of you.